about CSS if I didn't include everybody's favorite GIF of CSS. This is exactly how we all feel sometimes when you try to change one thing and your modal moves halfway across the page, all of a sudden your navigation's in a column and not a row. We all kind of just want to tear the blinds down and do that with our CSS sometimes. And the point of this talk is to help us figure out how to not do that. So to get started, I wanted to show everybody an example of some CSS that could be better. So we're looking at this and we don't really know what any of these things there are. We see RT T head and we think, okay, well maybe that's row table, but then why would it have a table head? And then you see React table down further below, and that confuses you even more because then are these other ones also for React table? And it's just, you look at the structure and it's kind of hard to figure out what's going on. I'm sure it looks beautiful, but when you are trying to read through the CSS file, it's a little difficult, it's a little clumsy, and it takes you a while to understand what's happening. So the first one that we're going to talk about is object-oriented CSS, and that is pretty much like object-oriented programming, if you're familiar with that. So that's based on the idea that interfaces are made up of multiple components, and they should be reused as much as you can. So you want to use your navigation container and reuse it on every page. You don't want to create a new one. You want to have the same button throughout your application. You want to have the same forms if you have places where users can fill out forms. This helps make things more consistent so that as you are using your site, as users are using your site, it makes more sense. And so rather than just talking about this, I'm going to go show you a few code examples. And I've been big into this quite a bit for us just to try to help everybody see, because I don't know what size screens we're all on. So in this example, well, I guess before I get into that, if you're wondering why this is in React, and if you're wondering if that's important and if that's pertinent to this, it's not. I was just having fun and I built this in React, thinking that maybe I could build on this and do other talks at some point. So ignore the React part if you're not familiar with it. That's not important. We're just going to focus on these HTML tags. So first here, we have our div, and we have an image inside of it, and then we have another div with an iframe. And so if we want to style this, we want it to make some sense so that while we look at the markup, we can look at the class name for the style and say, okay, I know exactly what this is for and what this is going to be styled. So here, let's see, what do all these have in common? Well, they're all a form of media. So we can have our outermost div be a class of media. And inside we have an image. So we can do media dash image, and then here we could say media dash video, because even though it's an iframe, it is going to play a video. And so now if we come into this markup, rather than just seeing a div and an image and another div, we can look at these class names and see, okay, so these are all part of media. This one here, it's related to media, it's a media image. This one's same, it's a media video. And there's just a quick note, for React, we use class name instead of class. It's the same thing, it's just named differently. So if that seems odd to you, I hope it doesn't confuse you too much. So then going to the CSS for this, this is so much easier to read than that example that we just looked at. You look at this, so say you haven't seen your markup at all yet. You can look at the CSS file and say, okay, this is for media. This says media image, so it must be for an image. And the same thing for video. So that already, even though this is really small, and even though you had to actually use a word and you couldn't, abbreviate, so it's not as short as what everybody likes all the time, it makes sense. So after you've walked away from this and you come back a couple of days or a month or a year later, you can look at these and know exactly what you were doing, exactly what they're used for. And then in your CSS, you can see, okay, so I know exactly what these classes are. I know what I'm trying to style with this. So that's a really brief introduction to object-oriented CSS for us. There's a lot of different ways of implementing this. I know the way I chose was to use the double underscores here in the CSS, but in here I did the dashes. So you can do either one. And obviously if I want my CSS to work, I would need to use the double underscore, but just some kind of way of, you don't want to squish it together so that it's media image and you have to try to figure out what that says. So we use the underscores or the dashes to just help it be more readable. So moving on to our next one, not to be confused with SMACSS, we have SMACSS, which is one of my favorites because it does sound like snacks. And also because there's this whole book about it with this adorable little lumberjack that I can't get over. Every time I show people this slide, I talk about the lumberjack because I just love him so much. And so this is actually a book that we can find online where he really goes, the author goes into really deep detail on all of these rules that we're about to talk about. So SMACSS stands for Scalable and Modular CSS, and it follows 5 types of rules, which are the base, layout, module, state, and theme rules. And so the base rules are the ones that define the default styling for how an element should look in all instances on a page. So you want, if you have a button, that button looks the same everywhere. If you have a login form, that login form looks the same everywhere. Same with layout, it's very similar in that if you have navigation, it's the same everywhere. Your forms are the same, and those just define what the layout of your page is going to be throughout your site. So they divide your page into sections. That's your header, your footer, just different ways of like choosing layout for your site. So that could be anything. So if you have, don't look yet, okay. If you have some certain modals that you use or dialogues that pop up and they're always going to have the same layout, those can also be layout rules. And in his book, Jonathan Snook here, he says that he likes to name things, each class, if it's for a layout or a module, he likes to give it that name in the class name. He uses just like L for layout or M for module, but states that layout also works and module also works, which I like because that makes more sense when you go back and read it later. So moving on to the module rules, those are pretty much the same. They're just a little more specific in that those are your sidebars, those are your carousels, those are your dialogues. So they all, you can see how the base, layout, and module all kind of overlap each other and help you style your components and your elements throughout your site. And then we have our state rules, which those help you describe how these elements are going to look in certain states, like hover, loading, saving, an accordion that can be opened or closed. So those are your states. And then we have theme, which think of this as like Facebook or Twitter or Netflix, how they, everywhere on their site, you know you're on their site because they have the same color schema, they have the same font. So that's what the theme rules are. So you can come over here, take a look at our SMACSS example. So for this one, I've made a little navigation for us. So we can call this, let's see, we have our outermost div. So if we want to come in here later and we want this to make sense, we can call this our nav container. So that makes sense. If we see that in our CSS, we're going to know, okay, well, this is the container for a navigation component. So this inner div, if this is the nav container, then this must actually be our navigation for our nav block. And we have a heading. Since it's in our navigation container, I'm going to name it nav header. And then our UL, same thing. They're going to go with navigation list. And these can be navigation list item, navigation list link, or even better could be navigation item link. If you're okay with a really long name, you could of course do navigation list item link. I understand that is getting pretty long though, and that's, you know, that's a lot to copy and paste. So I would just go with nav item link. And then that's the same thing as our other example for object oriented. You come into our CSS and you can see that you've got your navigation container, and you generically, you can call it a block as well if you want to, because that's still, while that wouldn't be a layout rule, that could be a module rule. So you could have a block that's a module. So these can all, you know, no matter whether they're named block or nav, they still make more sense than B or red box or form. You know, even just plain form, like you would want nav form, block form, so that you could see in your CSS exactly what you're trying to style and exactly what elements are going to change if you go in and start editing things. So that is our SMACSS, my favorite one. And then we're going to go to BIM, which is the one that I'm the most familiar with. This is the one that I use the most. It's like React in that it's a component-based approach. If you don't know much about React, don't worry, I'll explain what the component-based approach means. So for this, we have what we call blocks, elements, and modifiers. And blocks are there an entity of their own. They are meaningful by themselves. They don't need anything else on the page. They don't depend on other elements on the page. They can just exist all on their own. Elements are basically the same thing because they're part of a block, but they have some kind of semantic meaning and they can't exist on their own. So think like a list item. A list item would be an element, whereas the whole list is going to be a block because the list item can't exist outside of that list. And then modifiers are flags on either your blocks or your elements, and they signify a change in behavior, a change in state. So think color, hover, opening, that kind of thing. And so something that can be kind of hard to figure out is when should I use a block and when should I use an element? Because they seem pretty similar, and these aren't always black and white rules. So you might be building a site and be a couple of divs deep and you're wondering anymore, okay, well, is this going to be a block or is this going to be an element? So a good way to differentiate between those is that a block is something that you're going to use when that section of code might be reused. And if it doesn't depend on any other elements on that page being implemented. So if you can take something out, if you can take that component out of that current markup, move it somewhere else, and it's going to work the same, that's going to be a block. An element is something that you can't do that with. And another way to figure out if something should be a block or an element is that you can't have a sub-element. So if you have something that's named an element and you realize that you're making a lot of sub-elements, then that needs to be a block because you can't have nested elements. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code example for this one. Oh no, there we go. Okay, so this is another navigation container for us. This one is because I think it's going to help make the most sense to help us pick out what the blocks are and what the elements are here. So our outermost navigation here, it's called a nav. So it's pretty easy to go ahead and think, okay, well, I can name that nav container. And here is where these double underscores really do make a big difference. So this one, if I want to be an element, I need this double underscore. And if I want it to just be a block, then I don't want this double underscore. I want nav. So I'm just going to give it nav because this is a block. I can take it out and it's going to be the same thing. So in here, this is an element because this list depends on my navigation container up here. So I'm going to call this nav list. And then down here, these are also elements because they depend on my list. So these are going to be nav double underscore list item. And let's see, this one says it's blue. So something we can do with this is the modifier, which is 2 dashes and then blue. So this one is going to be pretty similar. So I'll take this, I'll put it here. It's also an element inside of this block, but this one is red. So this one's going to be a red modifier. And this one is basically the same thing, but it's in a hover state, or it can be in a hover state. So that is going to be hover. And so now you look at this, and sure, these are kind of long, but what's different from object-oriented and SMACSS is that you can come in here and you can see pretty clearly with this structure that this isn't a block, this is an element. These are elements that have modifiers. And the argument can be made that you can take this out and it'll still work as just a list. So if you want, you could even make this nav container, and then this up here could be your block that is your nav. but I'll keep it this way because normally we do, if we want to have an accessible and semantic website, we do want to have this nav tag so that we know that this is for our navigation. So then we can come over here and we can take a look at our CSS. And since this one has a little more steps than the others, I did try to put some comments in here to help us. So we know that nav is our block. We know that nav UL is our element. We know that nav li is red. Hover, we know that those are modifiers. And so this is just like the other ones. You can come in the CSS and you can read this and you know what's happening. You know exactly what these are styling. I can know that, okay, well, I can go ahead and adjust this padding and it's gonna go where I think it's gonna go instead of on the other side of the page. It's not gonna go disappearing behind something because it's only styling just my list. So why should we use these? Because we just saw how much I had to type for some of these class names. There's an argument to be made that those class names are long, that you can find other ways of naming these, that sometimes it's harder to tell a block in an element. And there are a few different benefits. The biggest one is that it reduces the amount of CSS that you have to write and maintain. So you don't have to keep going in and writing more and more specific rules. You don't have to keep marking things as important. You don't have to worry about cascading rules conflicting with each other. And it provides when you write your CSS that way, it starts to provide a nice pattern for you to follow, for other developers to follow, for people who need to go in and do a bug fix. They can quickly understand your CSS and your markup, and they can understand the way that the code is organized. And so it just allows developers to work better in the code, to understand better what's going on with the CSS and with some markup. And that is really, I don't have a big slide because these are big, deep topics, and I figured that people would have a lot of questions, and that would probably be the best way to continue going on with this. So I will go ahead and open up for questions.
Yeah, so please feel free to unmute yourself and show your video so that we can see. Oh, or you can type in the chat, but we would love to have a conversation as well. There's some questions coming up in the chat if you want to read those.
Okay. Let me find. All right, I will stop sharing there so I can see the chat because it's hiding behind my screen there. Okay. Oh, so what makes SMACSS my favorite? I like SMACSS a lot because, I mean, aside from the fact that it's fun to say and does sound like SMACSS, I actually like that it's a little bit more flexible than Vim, and that I don't have to put so much thought into, is this a block or an element, when sometimes it seems like they overlap. I can just say, well, this is just for my layout. So I'm gonna prefix this with a layout, and then I'm gonna call it layout navigation, layout list. And so that still makes sense. It's still easy to go into the CSS and understand it, but then it just takes another step out. So I don't have to keep going back and forth on, is this a block or an element? I can just say, this is layout, and then move on. Oh, this is the theme for my editor. It's called A Touch of Lilac, I believe. Yes, A Touch of Lilac. It's a Furic font to make the text look all pretty. Yeah, thank you, Chloe.
You're welcome. So what one do you currently use at your place of employment?
I use Vim, which I do like, just not quite as much as SMACSS, but I still like it a lot. So Vim is especially useful in React, where everything's already componentized. So it's pretty easy to go ahead and start naming those because you already know, okay, well, this is my welcome component. So this is my welcome list. This is my welcome form.
So you name the blocks after the thing that you're styling?
Yes, yeah, we usually do, just because if you start to name everything block, it is going to get a little hard to understand what blocks you're looking at. So we do try to
Definitely.
stay away from just block. So React makes it easier by giving us the component name already.
This is going to be a noob question, but when I was in dev school, we only ever did one underscore. Is there like a reason why you guys use two?
The two is just because it's just a way to make sure that we know that it's an element. It's a little easier to see, it's a little longer, and that's what they have a BIM on the BIM's website. They actually do a better job of explaining that and go a little deeper into it. Yes, or as Cody likes to say, dunder. But you can change it too. This isn't, you know, these aren't anything that you have to download or install and put in your code. So if you prefer one underscore, you can definitely do that. And you still have that differentiation of block and element.
Nice.
Let's see. What do you think would be the best way to implement this company-wide? Well, I think a good way would be to maybe have a lunch and learn where you can kind of show people what these are, let people read up on it, maybe show an example like these, just even a small one, so that your coworkers can see what this looks like. Because when you first hear CSS architectures, especially if you're not familiar with it already, that sounds scary. That sounds like, no, I'm not doing that. Get those messed up lines away from me. So I think just taking time to kind of explain and show what it is would be a good way to share that company-wide. I see another one. Should one limit a project to only one of these methods at a time? I would, just for consistency. And so I know, like I was just telling Jordan, you can modify it to fit your project if these don't work perfectly for you. But you just want some consistency so that it's the same throughout your entire project, so that you know you can understand and follow that pattern.
One of the things I always find a little bit challenging when I use BIM is when you need to sort of combine two blocks together or have styles from two separate blocks somehow together. So perhaps you have like a nav, sort of the way you had nav listed out, but then perhaps you actually have a totally other block that you need to style within there. Could you talk a little bit about some strategies around how to combine different blocks together when you need to?
Yeah, I know the BIM method would say that we should make the outermost one the block and all the other ones are going to be an element. And so I know that still gets a little tricky because you can still say, well, I can take this out and it can exist somewhere else. So I'd say in that case, you can still make them blocks. And I think I have a few examples. Like there's a BIM naming cheat sheet website that I'll share in the chat here shortly, where they kind of help walk you through that. And you can, so, okay, well, I have all these nested blocks. And then it just shows you, okay, well, you can take, say, your outer div and name it, you know, block container. You want something more specific than that. And you can keep naming them that way so that they are nested, but the ISO is clear and makes sense so that when you look at it later, you know exactly what you were trying to style. So I know that one definitely is tricky.
So I've definitely been, oh, I guess some in the chat too, but I've definitely been in a couple of like code bases where there's not a consistent like style or whatever. Like maybe they started one way and then they just lost their way and then they started another thing. And like, what would you suggest to like, and I'm sure everyone knows this or has experiences, but like trying to change like CSS classes and stuff like that, or it's crazy. So anyway, do you have any suggestions for how to like get all that on the same page?
Yeah, that one, that's always fun because like you said, you try to change one class name and all of a sudden everything on the website has changed and you didn't even know that everything was using that class name and you don't know how or where it's coming from. So the way that I and my team usually handle it is going forward, we try to implement BIM. And if we have to go in and edit something, we'll try to clean it up. And if we know what we're going to affect, if we're able to figure that out, then we'll rename it to meet our standard, the BIM standard. But if not, then we just kind of do the best that we can and just keep the approach of we'll clean up and make clean things as we move forward and add new features.
Did you answer the question from Chandel and Julie in the chat? Sorry if I missed it.
Let me
Housekeeping.
see. Yes, I got to those. I don't know. Did that answer your questions? The responses I gave? Okay.
Just making sure. I was doing a couple housekeeping things. Anyone else? Feel free to speak up or type in the chat.
Yeah, certainly. So base rules are going to be things like, oh, I'm sorry, let me read the questions so that everyone knows what I'm talking about. Alice asked if I can give more examples of module versus base rules for SMACSS. And so base rules are things that are going to be consistent across your entire site. So if you want your font to be the same, if you want your background color for the body to be the same everywhere, your button styles, those are your base rules. That's something that's not going to change. And you want to leave those base rules because if you have to overwrite them at all, if you have to use that important tag, then they're not a base rule. And module are the smaller things that you don't need those base rules for. So you could say like the button text could be a module rule. Let me see, what were some of my other examples? Like carousels and dialogues. Those are not going to be your base rules per se, because dialogues, you know, sometimes you're going to have a longer bit of text for a dialogue, and sometimes you're going to have a shorter bit. So you can't really say these are all styled the exact same way, because sometimes that text can go flying off the edge of the dialogue, and sometimes it's not. And then sometimes your carousels are going to be styled differently. Call outs, those are something that sometimes are going to be styled one way and sometimes will be styled another way. They're just kind of the base rules. I think a good thing to remember there is if this is always going to look the same exact way and it's not going to change, then it's my base rule. And does that help? It's okay to say no, that still doesn't make sense.
When you are like spinning up a new project, where do you start? Do you start with like the HTML and then kind of come up with some basic CSS?
Yeah, I do. I usually, at this point, I can kind of, as I'm doing HTML, I can kind of see as I'm going along what the CSS is going to be. So I try to start from the out and like the outermost components and work my way in. So like in Navlist, the first thing I'm going to do is build that container. That container is what my navigation items are going to go in. So I'm going to style that. I'm going to give it, you know, the right width and the height and the color. And then I'm going to put my list and my list items and just keep going down that chain to style that way. Oh, yes. Yes, the friend behind me. I actually have two. I don't know if you can see both of them. This one that you can see is Tashi. and there's another one that's a little further behind me that's Ruby. Well, thank you for asking. That made my day. Let's see. Are there other CSS architecture structures that are very common? There are a few others. I didn't talk about them as much because there's not as much out there about them. But there's like atomic CSS, where a separate class is created for every reusability property. There's attribute modules for CSS, AMCSS. Don't remember much about that one, but that's the acronym. And there's one called Fun, which is like a flat hierarchy of selectors, utility styles, and something for the N. It's a very long name for such a tiny acronym, but there are a few others, and there are a few articles out there if you're interested in looking those up. I don't have a whole lot of information on those, so I can't tell you a whole lot more about them, unfortunately. Yeah, I can definitely recommend some more websites or books to learn more. I put in the chat the BIM naming cheat sheet. That's one that's really good. There's object-oriented css.org. That one is the object-oriented CSS. There is SMACSS. I believe it's just, yeah, smacks.github.io. And then there are a few CSS tricks articles that go over kind of the gist of all of these. And I'll share, let me see, I can probably open it right up and share my list of links in the chat for everybody. All right, let me make sure I'm getting these. What's my favorite method? Mine is, I do like SMACSS. I just like that it is, I like the rules. I like the 5 rules. I know this is layout. I know this is my base. I know this is my module. And I like them a lot too, but SMACSS is just, I don't know, maybe that cute little lumberjack really is why it's my favorite. Maybe it's just having more sway over me than I thought. Let's see. What about mobile considerations in SMACSS? That's a good question. I actually, we do have, you can have your screen decorator, so you can use your screen sizes and you can use those for SMACSS. I don't think I've used the naming convention for that. That's a good question. I'll have to do more research into that. Let's see. How to handle if you want to share a modifier. Let's see. So an example is in 2 different elements, you have to make separated classes. So you can do, I know for Sass, when we have to do that, we create variables so that we can conditionally render our elements with modifiers. And so that's the way that we handle it in Sass. For CSS, it's gonna be a little trickier. I mean, you could still do it in JavaScript if you really wanted to, but it's not gonna be as pretty anymore. So, see, I haven't tried it for CSS, but for Sass, I can definitely say you can just create your variables, and it still works. It's still clean, and you can easily conditionally render the styles that you're trying to get. Does that help, or is that still no, not helpful? Okay, let me move this over here. I just realized I'm not even looking at my camera. I'm looking at my screen. There we go. Now I'm looking at you. I'll share these links that I told you all I would share with you. And I'll be sharing my slides. I can share those on the meetup page if that's easiest. And I can share them in the DFW Slack. Okay, oh, that's a lot of links. Okay, spam the chat there. Okay, do you use these CSS architectures when modifying CMS, or is it just for custom built websites? You can use them for modifying the CMS, assuming that you're not gonna have to undo too much work. If you need to, it might have to be the method we were talking about earlier, where just going forward, you can try to implement them. So that might be a good approach for that. Oh no, no permission to copy. I just shared the link so you can look at them.
Can people not click through?
I think, sorry, Jen, can you make me a host again and I'll try to fix that. About that, everyone. My internet, of course, like the one time I did it, is not doing well.
That's how it works, doesn't it? Let's see, I can also, just so that everybody can get them, I can also share these on the meetup page in a comment. These are, I refer to the SMACSS book a lot and the BIM cheat sheet. I go there a lot.
Okay.
Thank you, Erica.
So if there's not any more questions, here in just a second, I will break y'all out into small groups. Carissa, can you make me a host? I'm so sorry.
Let's see.
I don't have any of the permissions, but feel free, unless there's no other questions, feel free to hop off. I'll give y'all a couple more minutes to ask them if you have them. We would love for you to, ask, but otherwise, that's what we're doing next. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes, of course. Yeah, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me if you're in Slack or Twitter or anywhere, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. I'll put my...
Yeah. Oh, we'll just kind of keep the small groups pretty casual. So if you just want to chat about whatever your jobs, questions you have about coding, anything like that, CSS, we'll do our best to answer them. So yeah, just a couple more minutes and then we'll do that. I'll let anyone who wants to drop off before I break y'all up.
Always happy to answer more questions about my dogs.
If enough people drop off, we might not have to do breakout rooms.
Chanel, come on.
You can show my dog during the break.
Oh, Holly.
Holly, do you miss me?
She always misses you, Chanel.
She's probably, well, actually, you take her to work with you, so nothing's different for her, really.
We actually had to go by the building today because I've just been working from home, and she was so excited. Sorry, I'm trying to mitigate the sundown in my room here.
I'm honestly just glad that mine didn't try to shove her face through the blinds that whole talk. So
Yeah, my dog claimed as his favorite. He's not for husband right now, unfortunately.
This is what Holly likes to do. She likes to stand on the desk.
oh.
Holly, if you always have your head down, everyone thinks you're sad.
Oh.
Do y'all want to meet Pig?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, that was the best reveal.
He twins.
She was already in my lap, as usual.
That's amazing.
Say hi, Pig.
What kind of dog is Pig?
She's a Cocker Spaniel Poodle mix.
An adorable one.
Dang. That's a bougie dog.
Well, we got her from Craigslist, if that makes you feel better.
Nice.